I really like it. I really like it when we have a video where we talk about the DPS and the state of the DPS right before the season, and a few hours later Blizzard comes out with some more balanced tuning. Now, I don't want to jinx it, but this looks like it's going to be the last of the balance tuning right before the release of the season. No doubt, into the season we are going to get more balance tuning, but at the very least until the release we might tentatively say this is the last one of the changes. So let's go over and see exactly what they changed, also knowing more or less which of the specs are supposed to be doing well and which of the ones are supposed to be doing badly, to see which specs are being touched by these changes, starting with Unholy. So this is a good one. It's a good one because Unholy is middling, it's somewhat disappointing, it's not been doing too well. Now, the changes for Unholy are yet another sweeping buff to all of their abilities, excluding their burst. So they get buffed in Death Coils, Core Strike, the Ghoul, baseline damage, Virulent Plague, and Apocalypse, not touching things like Gargoyles, things like Army of the Dead. This totals out to being a 3.5 to 4% damage increase, which is helpful given that right now Unholy DK was not doing too well in single target at the very least. So with this buff, they will go from being terrible to being bad, which is an improvement for Unholy Death Knight. Obviously, nothing major is being changed, nothing about the mechanics of their tier set, for example, etc, just a minor damage increase across the board for the spec. We are now touching something that we were supposed to be talking about today, the tank video in Mythic Plus. I'm going to give you a spoiler for what's gonna come tomorrow. Vengeance Demon Hunter was supposed to be the S tier tank in Mythic Plus for this season. However, they get nerfed now. Also, another spoiler, no, this nerf is not gonna do anything for preventing Vengeance being S tier in this season. The Amir Drasil tier set has the bonus damage of Sigil of Flame nerfed by 20%, which is irrelevant. You are doing way more damage than before after the rework, and the 20% damage just from the bonus of Sigil of Flame, not the entire damage of your Sigil of Flame, is rather minor. What hurts way more, again, it's not knee breaking, you're not getting destroyed by this, but it's more hurtful, is the fact that now Illuminated Sigils, arguably the strongest talent in your entire tree for Vengeance, for Mythic Plus at the very least, Illuminated Sigils now increases the parry chance against affected targets by 15% only, instead of 20%. Illuminated Sigils is a new talent which basically allows you to tie a lot of defensive power to Sigil of Flame. Now you have two charges of Sigil of Flames, you have multiple ways to both extend the duration of Sigil of Flame, but also reduce the cooldown of Sigil of Flame, and the longer you can keep it running, the more you can keep up this extra 20% parry, which is very, very good in preventing damage from the biggest source of damage in Mythic Plus for a tank. I'm going to ask everyone, what's the biggest source of damage in Mythic Plus that a tank is going to be taking? Of course, it's melee auto attacks. That's almost like 60-70% of all the damage a tank is gonna take in Mythic Plus. And parry is very good against that kind of damage. So this nerf is hurtful. This nerf makes Vengeance slightly less tanky and do slightly less damage. It's still gonna keep them more than strong enough to be the strongest tank for Mythic Plus in this next season. What we have after them is another tank. This one, on the other hand, another spoiler, is on the opposite side of the charts compared to Vengeance, which is Guardian. Guardian, part of the Exodia comp in Season 2, has been going down quite a lot. We will see tomorrow, probably, unless Blizzard decides to add more changes, why Guardian has fallen more in the ratings for a tank, but unfortunately the buffs in here are very minor. You have a very slight energy regen buff in cat form for Guardian. Okay, the other buff is the more relevant one, which is that Mangle now grants 12 rage instead of 10. This is overall a good buff if you consider that one of the biggest problem of this nerfed version of Guardian is that their rage generation has been nerfed. They have gotten roughly 15% less rage regen from basically losing the Aberrus tier set, which was giving them this regen, and the new tier set not having anything to do with rage regen. On top of that, Blood Frenzy was nerfed, so now Thrash gives you way less rage regen as soon as you're fighting more than 8 targets. So this rage regen is going to be a problem in Season 3, and now Blizzard gives you a tiny little bit of help with Mango, giving you more rage. Still not a major type of change. We also have the same cut energy regen buff for balance. What is way more important though in terms of buffs to cat form is the one to Resto Druid, because Resto Druid gets 140% more damage to Rip, 60% more damage to Rake, 140% more damage to Shred, 200% more damage to Ferocious Bite, on top of more energy regen. This is a very nice kind of buff, because this is a skill ceiling increase type of buff, because this is going to oust, is going to expose all of the lazy Resto Druids in Mythic Plus keys, the ones that just spend their time spamming Wrath, landing a couple of Moonfires and Samfires, and doing 10 to 15,000 DPS. Now though, if you want to be a good Resto Druid in Mythic Plus, you can do upwards of 40 or 50,000 DPS in a key by properly utilizing your cat form, your cat weaving, your party, knowing that the damage intake of the party won't be that high for this moment, so go into cat form and make use of this free time to do way more damage now with this kind of buff. It's not that you get buffed in damage by going AFK and just spamming Sunfire, and now you do top damage. Now, to actually do good damage, you have to properly use your toolkit, properly know the fight, know when you can go into cat form, when you can take advantage of free time without the need of healing. So it's a nice type of damage buff for Resto Druid. We then have, well, the nerf of the day, the nerf of the week, the nerf of the preseason in general, another nerf to augmentation. Now, the first take, napkin math, it's a 10 or even more percent, 10 to 11% nerf to the damage of augmentation. Ebonmite now gives an even smaller main stat buff. It's down to 6.5% now instead of 8%. Close as Clutchmates now increases the effectiveness of Ebonmite and Breath of Eons by only 10% instead of 20%. And lastly, the amount of verse gained by Shifting Sands has been reduced by 15% as well. So basically, your mastery power when it comes to verse has also been nerfed. So not much else to say. It's not that it's going to touch your rotation for whatever little of a rotation you can have as an augmentation invoker. It's not changing the mechanics of the specs, it's just doing less damage overall. This is likely going to continue to expose the fact that even as augmentation keeps being nerfed, it's going to remain a staple, especially in the raid. It does bring slightly more of a case for not bringing it in Mythic Plus, but as usual, the main problem of augmentation in Mythic Plus is that it does something no other DPS can do, which is significantly buffing the power of your tank and buffing the power of your healer, which allows you to do things other DPS cannot do. By being able to heal more, being able to be more tanky, take more damage without dying. These are things augmentation can help tanks and healers with that no other DPS spec can. So we will see if even after these nerfs it will somewhat change the state of augmentation in Mythic Plus, even though it's not very likely for now. We then have a quite small change to Frostmage. This is a very minor buff to single target in return for a very minor nerf in AoE, which is also good because that's what Frost was about. Frost was doing middling single target damage and was pretty solid in AoE. Now the initial single target hit of Glacial Spike is going to hit more, but the AoE explosion around Glacial Spike is going to do less. So it is mostly just a trade of damage profiles for Frost. Brewmaster. Interesting change for Brewmaster because Breath of Fire's bonus damage is increased to 40% instead of 20%. So it's a double effectiveness buff to the 2-piece, And the 4-piece set bonus damage to targets afflicted by Breath of Fire has been increased to 15% instead of 10. This is a good kind of buff to give them more damage. Now, because of the way their tier set works, this type of bonus damage also becomes bonus passive healing overall. However, as we will see from our tank video, this is not exactly the main problem with Brewmaster. If we're talking about Mythic Plus, for example, it will be generally the problem of Brewmaster is that the higher you go in keys, eventually you will reach a certain point, a certain level of the key where you're simply taking far too much damage because you have very little self-healing, very little way to be independent of a healer, not needing externals, etc, etc. This is something that usually prevents Brewmaster from pushing very high at the end of a season, for example. This helps by giving you some more consistent healing thanks to your tier, but it's likely not going to magically solve the problem of Brewmaster for this season. Unfortunately, this is also the same that we can talk about when it comes to Windwalker. Another one of the specs currently simming very, very poorly. Windwalker gets a 2.5% damage increase with their buff. Blackout reinforcement granted by melee abilities now occurs 66% more often and increases the damage by 200% instead of 150. It is still reasonably minor considering the current state of the spec in both single target and AoE. What we then have is just a very simple overall 3% damage buff to Ret, which is pretty good. Ret was also another one of the specs in single target doing quite poorly. It's interesting that considering they are definitely more solid in AoE than in single target, it's interesting that Blizzard decides to buff all of Ret. They're not targeting the single target of Ret, which was the weak part. They are also hitting them in their AoE department, which is pretty good for Mythic Plus overall, so it's a pretty nice change for Ret. What is not nearly as nice is Discipline, which receives another round of nerfs. Divine Aegis absorption has been reduced to 5% of the healing done instead of 10%. Divine Aegis is the talent turning your crits into an absorb shield for 10% of the healing done. Now it's down to 5. This is not a very major part of your toolkit. It's not even going to amount to 5% of your total healing as a Discipline Priest, so it's not that relevant, at least not nearly as much as the nerf to Inescapable Torment, the damage reduced by almost 20%. This is another set of damage nerfs given to Discipline. Discipline had, after this rework in this patch, very high damage, especially in AoE, thanks to the tier set, and thanks to how much you could reduce the cooldown with Void Summoner, how much you could reduce the cooldown of Mindbender to have almost a permanent Mindbender in Mythic Plus. Which means if you have a near permanent Mindbender, Inescapable Torment gets tons of value, because it's active very, very often. So this nerf is actually somewhat necessary and expected in terms of damage for Discipline. Then, just to not get people confused, this is not Assassination being buffed or being changed, okay? The 4-piece set bonus has an accurate tooltip reflecting what it does in-game, and the 4-piece set single target damage has been increased by 4%, but this just refers to the 4-piece itself. It's not all of the damage of Assassination, just a fix to the 4-piece, which totals out to be something like a 0.15% damage increase for the spec. So it's not actually a proper change for Assassination. Where we get a proper change, which is quite confusing, is to Warlocks, because Destruction gets a damage increase to their tier set to Flame Rift by 50%, and then Unstable Tear damage is increased by 5%, Shadowy Tear damage by 5%, and Chaos Tear damage increased by 30%. What is confusing about all of this is that when we add the buff to Demo, which is damage to the Doombrand of their single target damage of the tier set is increased by 50%, the Doomfiend, the AoE, the Shadowbolt Volley, AoE spamming pet summoned by the tier set is increased by 40%. What is interesting about this is that right now, as we have talked about this already, right now Demo is the only somewhat human kind of spec for Warlocks. They are doing both pretty badly in Mythic Plus as well. They are expected to both be terrible, and even Demo, while doing better than them, is nothing special. So It's interesting that Blizzard doesn't touch Affliction, buffs Destruction by 2.5%, and then buffs Demo by 3.5%. Demo, who already was the stronger of the three specs. Maybe in their internal testing, Affliction turned out to be the stronger one, and they are basing the balance tuning around that? Because otherwise, this set of changes for Warlocks is quite confusing as to why Demo is being buffed, but Destruction is being buffed for less, and Affliction is not being buffed at all. That's curious. Despite that, neither of these two specs are getting particularly more powerful with these two changes. They will continue to be, both of them, relatively weak in the coming season. This is all we have for today for the set of changes given to the specs right before the release of the season. Now, we will see, as mentioned, after the season releases, what will be Blizzard's adjustments to the specs based on the results of the players in both Mythic Plus and the Raid. But this is what we have for today, with of course the clear biggest change being the yet another nerf to Augmentation Evoker. So for today we can stop here. Thanks of course as usual on this Saturday to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel as usual, which can also as usual be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, at this point, this has been the trend for the PTR tuning. Why aren't Outlaw and Havoc part of this tuning? Why aren't they both being nerfed? Who knows?